let's start with a story. Imagine it's 1945. You're just a young boy in Germany. The war is finally over, and your father, who was a devoted Nazi supporter, he overhears a conversation. He turns to your mother and says he has to either kill the entire family or just himself. Well, the next day, after one last family outing, he goes into his office and shoots himself. That was the reality for a boy named Helmut. And his story is just this chilling reminder of the very human cost of the ideology we're about to dissect. And it forces us to ask a really, really terrifying question.
Right. How does this happen? Look, this isn't just some dusty history lesson. The story of Nazi Germany is a stark warning. It's a case study in how a democracy can completely unravel, how an entire nation can get seduced by promises of greatness, and ultimately, how it can just sleepwalk right into its own destruction. So, how on earth did it happen? So, here's how we're going to break this down. Think of it like a funnel of causality. We're going to start wide with the big national problems, and then we're going to narrow our focus, step by step, to see exactly how Germany ended up in the hands of one single catastrophic regime. Okay, so our story begins in the ashes of World War I. Germany lost, the old empire completely collapsed, and into this power vacuum, a brand new democracy was born, the Weimar Republic. But here's the thing, it was born into absolute chaos. It was built on a foundation of sand, right from the get-go. You see, from the very beginning, the German people never really embraced this new government. And why? Well, because pretty much the very first thing this new republic had to do was sign a document that basically sealed its fate and became this symbol of national shame. Let's be clear, the Treaty of Versailles was not a peace treaty. It was a punishment. Just look at how Germany was systematically dismantled. It lost huge chunks of its industrial heartland, its entire colonial empire, and its military was completely gutted. And then, to top it all off, came the War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept 100% of the blame for the entire war. And then came the bill. £6 billion. I mean, that's just an astronomical, impossible sum for a country whose economy was already in total ruins. There was just no way to recover from that. And that is the crucial takeaway here. From its very first day, the Weimar Republic was linked with humiliation and defeat. Every single time a German felt the sting of this treaty, who did they blame? They blamed the democracy that signed it. It poisoned the well from the very start. So you have this incredibly weak foundation. But then came the earthquakes, a series of political and economic crises that just shattered what little stability the republic had. And that created the perfect opening for some very radical voices to be heard. And part of the problem, believe it or not, was a fatal flaw built right into the Weimar Constitution itself, a system called proportional representation. Now, on paper, it sounds pretty fair, right? The percentage of votes a party gets is the percentage of seats it gets. But in practice? In practice, it meant that dozens of tiny little parties got seats in parliament, making it nearly impossible for any one party to ever get a real majority. And the consequence of that system? Absolute chaos. Just think about it for a second. 20 different governments in only 14 years. With leadership constantly changing, the government just looked weak, indecisive, and totally unable to solve any of Germany's massive problems. And then came the 1-2 punch that knocked the economy out cold. First, in 1923, to try and pay its debts, the government just started printing money, and this made the currency literally worthless. We're talking people's entire life savings not being able to buy a single loaf of bread. Then, just as things kind of stabilized, thanks to American loans, bam, the Great Depression hits in 1929. The loans vanished overnight, and the German economy completely imploded. By the early 1930s, 6 million Germans were unemployed. And that's not just a statistic, you know? That's 6 million people who were desperate, angry, and absolutely terrified. They had lost all faith in democracy and were willing to listen to literally anyone who promised a solution. Any solution. And into this perfect storm of anger, humiliation, and desperation stepped a man with simple, powerful, and incredibly dangerous answers. Adolf Hitler. I mean, just look at this list. Hitler's message was perfectly tuned to what people were feeling. To a humiliated nation, he promised pride. To a disarmed nation, he promised a new army. To the millions of unemployed, he promised jobs. He promised to rip up that hated Treaty of Versailles, and above all, to make Germany strong again. He told people exactly what they were desperate to hear. And the result is, well, it's absolutely stunning. Look at this. In 1928, the Nazis were just a fringe party, barely getting 2.6% of the vote. But just 4 years later, deep in the Depression, their support exploded. They became the single largest party in Germany with 37%. The despair of the entire nation had fueled their meteoric rise.
Now, gaining power through an election was one thing. But here's the thing about Hitler. He had zero intention of playing by democratic rules. Once he had his foot in the door, he immediately set about burning the whole house down.
And what's just staggering is the speed of this takeover. I mean, look at this timeline. January 30th, he's appointed chancellor. Less than a month later, a mysterious fire breaks out in the Parliament building, and that becomes the perfect excuse to pass the fire decree, which suspends all basic rights like free speech and assembly. And then, just a few days after that, comes the final nail in the coffin.
It was called the Enabling Act. And this single law gave Hitler the power to make any law he wanted, on his own, without anyone's approval. In just over 1 month, democracy was legally dead. The Weimar Republic was over, and the Third Reich had begun. All right, so we've seen how he took power. Now we have to get into the why. What was this twisted worldview, this core ideology that drove him and his followers to commit such unimaginable horrors? At the very heart of Nazism was this bizarre, pseudoscientific, racist pyramid. At the tippy top, you had the so-called pure Nordic German Aryans, the master race. Below them, you had other, lesser groups. And then, at the absolute bottom, considered subhuman, an anti-race, were the Jewish people. The second core idea was something called Lebensraum, which is German for living space. Hitler believed that his German master race needed more land and more resources to thrive. And this meant conquering the lands to the east, places like Poland and Russia, and either enslaving or just eliminating the people who lived there, and then resettling the area with Germans. And let's be absolutely clear about this. These beliefs were never just abstract ideas. They were a direct and explicit blueprint for conquest, for ethnic cleansing, and for mass murder. And this table just lays it out plain as day. You can see exactly how the twisted theory became horrifying practice. The obsession with racial purity led directly to the persecution and the eventual genocide of Jews, Gypsies, and so many others. The quest for Lebensraum led directly to the invasion of Poland and the start of World War II. And the need for totalitarian control, well, that led to the Gestapo and the concentration camps. Which really leaves us with one final haunting question, doesn't it? The collapse of Germany's democracy didn't happen overnight. The warning signs were all there: the economic desperation, the political chaos, the constant demonization of minorities, and of course, the rise of a leader who promised to fix everything by just throwing the democratic rules out the window. It really makes you wonder, if those signs are clear, what stops it from happening again? What guardrails, what convictions are strong enough to keep a democracy from sleepwalking into its own destruction?